Next to them was a door which led up to a flat over a little sweet shop. Well, that little sweet shop, I don't suppose, was more than 10 feet wide. That had a good array of sweets, everything you could think about. But that was Mrs. Trickercap, that. Or and cigarettes and tobacco and pipes. That was Mrs. Trickercap, that. Next to that was Bales, the greengrocer. Well, he worked somewhere, and his wife stayed at the shop, and they had 2 sons. I went to school with them. But at some time or other, whether that was early morning or what, he used to disappear with his wooden cart on 2 wheels, box cart, and he'd come back with the greengrocery, cabbages, potatoes, everything, and he used to keep that well stocked. I somehow think he worked at Ransom, Sims and Jeffries, but being young I didn't bother much about that. I lived in the next house, but between Bale's grocer's shop and the house I lived in, there was a passageway that was called Cook's Court. Well, anyhow, at the end of this Cook's Court, that was a narrow passage, was about 3 little cottages, and three pairs of elderly people lived there. They were nice people. We knew them. We used to speak to them when they came out, but that's who lived there. Mm-hmm. Then I lived in the big house with my family.
And that was haunted?
That house was haunted. Oh yes, that was haunted all right. And no one will tell me otherwise, because I've heard it. Then next to that was Tollymash's entrance to their bottling department. That stretched right through to Lower Orwell Street. That was about 30 feet wide. The gate, that was one big single gate, and that took 2 men to open it and shut it. Then next to that was a second-hand shop. That was kept by a Mrs. Spurgeon. She had a son and a daughter. They were older than me, so I didn't know anything about them. That was a second-hand shop. I think that is a reasonable trade. Then next to that was another little shop, kept by an elderly man. Never knew if he had a wife. If she did, I never saw her. Now that had a window about 6 feet wide and about 5 feet high. That was an antique shop where you could buy things for 6pence and some of them 2pence. But in those days, if you'd had a £5, which we very rarely saw, if you'd had £5, you could bought all his stock in his window. But if it had been today, £5,000 wouldn't have bought that. Anyhow, next to that was a pork shop. Now that man sold pork and he sold milk. And that had, Spurgeon's didn't have an overhang on the next floor. The little shop, antique shop, had a shallow overhang over the window. But the pork butcher's shop, I can't think of his name, that had a good overhang. So if that rained, you could shelter under that. Well, you went down a step to that, and he had a little gate made up of square timbers that was painted brown. And it was beautifully clean. So was he. Well, he'd sell pork cheeses, sausage rolls, sausages,
all the things that a pork butcher
all the things the pork butcher had, and milk, and eggs. Then next to that was Mr. James' shop, Arthur James. Well, he was a nice old boy with a red face. In fact, he was one of the men that I met when I started rapiers that taught me the beginnings of using a lathe. Anyhow, he had this shop. They specialised in high-class chocolates, but they sold the usual dolly mixtures and licorice strips and sherbet suckers and sherbet dabs. They also sold, later on, a drink called Tozer. Well then, his wife dressed like a sand hourglass. She was nearly divided in the middle, but she wore a dark blouse and a white frill round the top of the neck and a frill down the front hole with buttons. But they were black buttons. Then she had a black shiny belt round her waist, Then she went bulged out again to a long black skirt. But usually on top of that skirt and just halfway up her chest, she'd had a little white apron. I never saw her with a hat off. She might have slept in the floor, I know. But she had a black hat. I suppose they called it ruche work all round. And that was about half as big as a top hat in height. And that used to have two hat pins stuck in, one either side with a big black shiny...
Like jet.
Jet, that's right. Knobs on. But she was a very nice woman. She was a very pleasant woman. She treated us like grown-ups instead of
Children.
rough little Herberts. Anyhow, next to that was a public house called the Wheat Sheaf. Well, you went up 2 steps with that, and there was a sort of foyer at the top of the steps. That was all timbered with chevron brickwork in panels.
Yes.
Then you turned, looked right, and there was a big door there. We never went in, but it was the bar. It was a Wheat Sheaf public house, but as we come out of down the steps into the road again, and there were windows about 5 foot from the height of the path, mullioned windows with all diamonds, glass, with a heavy door in the middle, so there was 3 one side and 3 the other. It was timber framed at the front, and it had an overhang also. But the overhang had a rounded shape on the front, and that also had carving in it as well. I can't remember what was carved on it. I think they were birds and elongated crocodile sort of things. Well, and above that rounded section was more plaster work and 4 windows up there, and in between those, the first window was white plaster, then there was a window, then there was a gap, and there was pargeting there where they had simple designs on. Then there was another window and more designs, another window, another design, and another window, and a clear space. Above that, of course, was another horizontal beam carved. I couldn't see what it represented, but above that there were 3 tapers going up, or I should say the peak of the roof, and that was finished off with this light plaster work. That now was occupied. That was a large house. My mother and father had the choice of that, but Mother didn't like it. She didn't like the diamond windows. She regretted that afterward, but never mind.